Thank you, Shaunaka Rsi, for participating in this interview on homosexuality in Hinduism, a very contentious and difficult topic for many. So thank you firstly for participating in this interview. As you're aware, in India recently, the subject of homosexuality has become a significant topic in light of the decision recently made by the Indian Supreme Court to decriminalize homosexuality. The Indian Penal Code of Section 377 was discarded, and now homosexuality is no longer considered a crime in India. The history of this law is quite significant because India was introduced to the law during British rule of India, approximately 80 years before it became independent of British rule. The British Empire, as part of its civilizing mission, at times dictated by Victorian Christian sense of morality, introduced this criminal law. And it wasn't not only in India, but many other colonies of the British Empire were also recipients of this law. And in fact, today, 36 out of 53 Commonwealth nations consider homosexuality a crime. So of all the global blocs, the Commonwealth of Nations is considered the most homophobic. And the origins of this law stem from the British Empire. However, the UK Parliament legalised homosexuality in England in 1967. Several former British colonies and India until recently were reluctant to remove the prohibition. Some have suggested that the overturning of the British era law criminalising homosexuality is not India modernising, but rather returning to its liberal stance shown throughout its history. Others in India have been disappointed by the court ruling and would prefer homosexuality to be prohibited. So my question for you is, what has Hinduism's attitude towards homosexuality historically been, in your opinion?
There isn't a black and white answer to anything in Hinduism. So there isn't an answer. This is the definitive approach to homosexuality, but we can definitely see a multitude of references. There's so many Sanskrit words that refer to homosexuality in different ways, and homosexual practices, that this is well recognized in the tradition, without doubt. It isn't penalized. Sexuality in itself, how it's dealt with in Hinduism it's kind of off the table of discussion a little bit.
Right.
No one wants to deal with it.
It's a taboo subject.
It's not taboo. It's very much recognized. Okay. I mean, you have the Kama Sutra, right, and you have temple carvings that are very explicit. You know, if you so people have an impression that they go to India on the one hand to enhance their sexual understanding of how to physically have sex, and on the other hand that it's the most repressive place that you can go to. And that's quintessentially Indian. I don't think that's a new thing. I think the fact that India is modernizing by getting rid of this law and simultaneously going backwards, that's very Indian. It's very Hindu. Hinduism has always been a work in progress, has always been developmental. Its essence is about development of consciousness. So that it's developing on all levels is nearly a given. So that the evolution can be cyclical, so that it goes up and also goes down. What were the influences for it to go down? You mentioned British Empire, but there were Islamic influences before that. In the very early days, the Islamic influences were quite benign, and instead of dismissing homosexuality and transsexuality and different practices they found in India that you find everywhere, they kind of embraced it and Islamicized it a little bit to make it more Islamic Indian. So the idea of eunuchs was kind of imported from the Middle East.
Right.
That didn't seem to be a practice before that in India. But the kind of the sinfulness of, to make it criminal is one thing.
Right.
You would make it criminal on a Hindu basis because it's somehow prohibited on a more mystical level that it's a sin or some such thing. But the prohibitions in the Samhitas, the law books, are quite mild. You know, I mean, if you have sex with a young virgin girl, you're given a really hard time. If a Brahmin has sex with another man, he can lose his caste is one thing, but he can atone and regain his caste. And then the other way of atoning for it is to take a bath with your clothes on. Right. Yeah. Not exactly feeling too bad about this. And that's really for a Brahmin male having sex with another Brahmin male who isn't a homosexual. He's just having fun. So the idea of sexuality per se is not something it's not that it's not discussed or not recognized. Well discussed, well recognized. It's not of interest to Hindu discourse. You know, your sexuality is your own thing. Keep it to yourself.
It's a private affair.
It's a private affair. You keep it to yourself. You control your own senses. Control of the senses, considered very important. So if you're endeavoring to control your senses, you're not interested to talk to someone about their lack of control of the senses. It's not a subject of great interest to you. So if someone wants to tell you about their homosexual sexual or their heterosexual or their heterosexual sexual practices, neither of us is of interest. The fact that someone is homosexual or heterosexual, but if they're trying to control their senses, actually their sexuality is not important. It's not an important part of discourse, and it's not a very important part of their identity in the light of the idea of Atma as a spiritual energy that's separate from the material, and sexual identity being part of the material is not. It's consequent on the body. Now it is interesting, the Samhitas and Ayurveda deal with the development of homosexuality. Very interestingly, they talk about it as a biological phenomena. So at the moment of conception, the sexual fluids of the man and woman mixing, the strength of the semen, there are all kinds of biological reasons that they put together to say, if it's like this, then it's going to be a male child. That's physically, those physical influences will generate the male. Will make it like that. And the other for the female, and then they talk about if the balance is absolute, then it's going to be the third sex. And there's an open discussion throughout all the texts, religious and spiritual and medical, about the third sex. This is just considered a biological phenomena. Right. So it's not a psychological issue. It's not an issue of choice. If it's an issue of choice, then you got to take a bath with your clothes on. Yeah. You know, but if it's a biological thing that you're just born like this, then that's not an issue. That's just a phenomena of birth. Yeah.
I want to come to the third sex shortly, because it's quite a peculiar phenomenon in the Vedic tradition, and I'd love to kind of expand on what that means. But before I go on that, you mentioned several texts. You mentioned the Kama Sutra. You mentioned, I think indirectly, the Manu Smriti as well. Now, these are very fascinating, interesting texts in the kind of Vedic canon. And the Kama Sutra, of course, vividly describes homosexual acts. The Manu Smriti, as you mentioned, refers to it as a mild form of atonement in respect to performing a homosexual act. These texts are particularly focused on specific areas, like the Manu Smriti is concerned with progeny and codes of conduct, and you have the Kama Sutra, which is a text focused on karma, enjoyment, pleasure. So do we see that different texts look at homosexuality in different ways according to their underlying objectives and purposes?
Yeah, I think that's a given. Yeah. I mean, if you're reading the Kama Sutra, you have some interest in sexuality. Yeah. So that's the lens through which you're seeing the world. Fine. So if you're reading the Bhagavad Purana, then you're not reading the Kama Sutra. It's not relevant for what your real interest is. So if you're starting out in married life and you're a man or a woman and you're trying to understand how to relate to your partner, or how suitable you are, what kind of sexual practices you should get involved in, the Kama Sutra is quite clear, and it helps you understand if you're Brahminically inclined, don't do these sexual things. they won't help you. They won't help your relationship, and so it's an interesting text from that point of view.
Right.
But it's about the sexual side of a relationship, which isn't the main part of a relationship, and the text would say it shouldn't be the main part of your life.
Right.
It shouldn't define you. But it is a part of your definition.
And homosexuality may be one of the topics that are.
Well, homosexuality is absolutely a topic in the Kama Sutra. The point is that this is recognized, that there are people, this third sex.
So is there any text that kind of completely condemns homosexuality or criminalizes it in the way that, the recent Indian law that was discarded?
There's no, homosexuality wasn't criminalized up until the 19th century.
Okay.
So I think that answers the question.
A kind of a foreign kind of.
Well, this was an edict that was sent out to the whole of the empire. To kind of help everyone conform to a certain way of seeing the world. And that's the documented history of it. So
although what we do see is that the Hindu texts acknowledge homosexuality as an act, but what about accepting homosexuality as an identity? Like, for example, if two men or two women wanted to marry and be, some sort of ceremony is performed to officiate that union, is there such examples, descriptions that can be found in Hindu texts or Hindu history?
In Tamil lore, there's the story of the two ladies, one the daughter of a king, one the daughter of a priest, who were such good friends they didn't want to get married, but the father insisted that they got married, and then by some quirk of fate, long story, but one of them ended up not being able to get married for strange reasons, and the other one then refused to get married, so he set them up by themselves, and they just lived together. Now, if it was sexual or just affection or anything, immaterial. These are two ladies going outside the social norm to live together based on their affection for each other, and their friendship and their which are big issues of relationship. So they transcended the norm in a sense. You have the story of Shikandi, who famous story from the Mahabharata, who was born a girl but her father wanted a boy, so trained the girl up as a boy, and she had no consciousness of her femininity until she got married. So she got married to a girl, and then on the wedding night the girl discovered she was a boy, she was a girl, and freaked a little bit. It's not surprising, I suppose. And so Shikandini, as she was, went off and met a yaksha. She was going off to kill herself because she thought, I've ruined that person. Oh my God, I've messed everything up. She went off to the forest, met a yaksha, and the yaksha gave her the benediction that she could be a man, and got the use of a phallus that she could perform exactly as a man by mystical arrangement. And she went back and proved herself to her wife. That's a complicated identity issue.
100%.
And then she goes out on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, and the warriors are thinking, well, hang on a minute, you're a woman. Are you a woman or are you a man? And
right. Again,
it was complicated for them. Who exactly was she?
Right.
And her intervention in the battle was pivotal. So, she's central, as an important character at a certain time of the story in the Mahabharata. Clearly gender identity issues going on.
Yes.
And there are many stories like this.
And of course this is a central text for Hindus, and so
but in all the texts, and in a lot of Bengali and Maharashtrian and Tamil and Keralan literature, you'll find so many examples like this.
You also have Arjun. I mean, some have equated Arjun's situation in his final year of exile.
Yeah.
And he has some curse from Urishi, and he spends that year as a eunuch, and I don't know what.
Yeah, I mean the word used is eunuch. Yeah. He wasn't someone without testicles.
Yeah. He wasn't castrated. Right.
He wasn't castrated.
Yeah.
It's just that's the word people translated from.
But it
from a 19th century perspective. We would say he was a cross-dresser.
Right.
Shikandi's case was female to male transsexuality.
Right.
But then you have another Tamil story of Lord Shiva. One of his devotees was having a baby. There was a flood, and her mother couldn't get across to help her. She was going to be the midwife. She prayed to Lord Shiva to help. Lord Shiva came, and the mother said, "But you can't go as Lord Shiva. You'll freak her out. You're a man. You can't be there at the birthing moment." So Lord Shiva turned into an elderly woman and went and delivered the child. And you get a lot of stories. You got a story of Lord Vishnu turning into Mohini to bewilder the Asuras. So he turns into the most beautiful woman imaginable, and he doesn't seem to have any difficulty with that. You have the story of Shiva and Vishnu coming together as two people, as two males, unifying and having a son. Hara Hari is that form. Hara Hari Sutta becomes the son. What's going on there? It's two males having a son. So, the how these stories open up identity, how they, in a sense, don't take identity very seriously, material identity.
Right.
They play around with these identities, and they don't have a problem with it because they're looking at things more spiritually. They're looking at the level of Atma.
Right. So if sexual orientation and gender identity isn't the most important thing or the valuable attribute of an individual, then what is the concern of these works and texts? That's Hindu philosophy, I guess.
In Hindu philosophy, they're concerned. They're living in a transcendent realm. So the self is eternal, and it's just passing through this body. So I have this body. I'm a white male, which from a middle-aged white male, from a diversity point of view, is the worst identity you can have these days. But so that's my identity now. But it's changing. I wasn't always white. I get suntanned. I didn't always have grey hair. I wasn't always middle-aged. I could change my nationality in the morning. So what's the most substantial identity? So the fact that my sexuality isn't very substantial is bound to this body. I could get born, I could be a misogynist in this lifetime, but get born in my next lifetime in a woman's body. So being a misogynist is not helping me for my next life. So these identities are transient. They're not our substantial identity. So what is that spiritual identity? What's the identity that lasts longer? What's the thing we can identify with that isn't, just based on material circumstance? And our sexuality is considered to be based on our material circumstance. So it's important for us in how we act in the world, and it's important that people are dealt with equitably.
Right.
That would be the transcendent vision. So when you're in a material circumstance, then you act appropriately to that circumstance. So if you're born into a third sex circumstance, then not a problem. That's who you are in that material circumstance. But your being is not dependent on it.
So just to clarify, what is a third sex? You have males, you have females. Also in India you have hijras, who are an important part of the Indian community. I mean, they dress extravagantly, glittering saris, makeup. They meander in crowds, knocking on taxis, and they're considered suspicious in many circles as well. So, what would you have to say about such people? And are they the third gender? I don't.
When you have children, they're brought to the house to say prayers over the children. When you have certain religious ceremonies, they're brought for auspiciousness as well as prostitutes. So, Hinduism actually is quite broad.
Right.
If you think about it from that perspective, the idea is that they're considered low class or over there, but they're also actually part of the community. So hijras is very specific. Most of them are eunuchs in the real sense of the term, but there are homosexuals as well that aren't that. There are lesbians that aren't that. There are people who are kind of transsexual in the sense that they either fully go transsexual and change completely. Hijra is kind of getting there. But you've also got hermaphrodites. So it's just anyone in those categories, and they're quite diverse. is considered the third sex because they don't kind of fall into one or the other easily.
Right.
So just to make it easier, you put it there.
Mm-hmm.
And you could say, someone has come up with this. I don't know how dynamic it is, but 10% of any community is, gay or transsexual or third sex. The issue is that third sex don't reproduce.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't reproduce themselves.
Okay,
so
that's the fundamental kind of
So it's always 10%.
Yeah.
So they're always going to be a minority.
Right.
And a minority is always a minority and will somehow always be treated like a minority.
Mm-hmm.
But they should be treated with respect and equitably.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not equal because they don't have the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
But there is equality on the spiritual level.
Right.
That spiritually we're all living beings and we all are deserving of that respect. And when it comes to the material, then we're all doing different things and etc. But you treat people equitably and you give everyone fairly. So if someone is third sex but they're a brilliant politician, then you elect them. Then you allow them to lead because they have that capacity. They're fully qualified for that. And so there's no there should be no barrier. Right.
So sexual orientation, gender, these are all peripheral. They're not important in that context. So
they're not important. They shouldn't be important in that context. Yeah. It is true that, say, homosexuals in India traditionally were barbers or masseuses, etc. So they had kind of tradition, but everyone in India had a traditional role like that. Yeah. But then there's all the stories of people stepping outside that. So in the modern context, there should be more capacity. Right. I mean, for me, when I first went on the metro in Delhi, that's when I kind of got it. You go on the metro in Delhi, you're there with all forms of human life, all castes, all religions, all creeds,
and all up close and personal.
Totally crushed in. So any issues of keeping your purity or your sanctity by not touching others is gone. Because you don't know who these people are. Right. So, there are levelers in the modern context, and this is inescapable the way India is developing. So there has to be a rethink about these things. Right. But equality is very difficult because some people are fat and some people are thin. Right. That's just life. Right. But to be equitable, to be fair, to be just, to make sure everyone has an opportunity, I think that's a different thing. And I don't think that that's good to legislate about. I think that's an educational issue. That's an issue as Hinduism talks about, or Indian culture talks about development of consciousness. People should understand that this is how society needs to work. Right. It's not a good society if it doesn't include these things. Okay. So that's something that people have to come to the conclusion. You can force them to try and do it, but that never works. Yeah. In actual fact, homosexuality was illegal in India. How many people were convicted? Right. No one cared. Everyone knew that there were homosexuals all over the place. 10% of the population. How many of them were going to be in your street, etc. They just live and let live. That's generally how people get on with things. And I think that's generally how Hindu civilization or Celtic civilization or Greek civilization, Roman civilization. I think if someone stands up and starts to make an issue of it publicly, that's when it starts to become difficult for people to live and let live.
So does Hinduism, I guess, does it need to modernize, or does it already have is it already equipped to address the fact that we have so much diversity in
yes, I think it is, because Hinduism has always been about diversity. Right. In fact, one of the two main reasons why commentators in the West from the time of Pythagoras have commented on India has been because of its pluralism and the idea of ahimsa, where they're vegetarian, they're ahimsa to the extent of vegetarianism, and they were fascinated by the idea of pluralism, and the idea of diversity has been central to Hindu understanding, or even Buddhist, Jain, Sikh understanding. So like Indian understanding, shall we say? It's been central that there is diversity, and every single individual is an individual spiritual spark. Right. So therefore they're individual. So their understanding, their darshan, their way of seeing the world is individual. So therefore there are as many religions and philosophies on the planet as there are individuals. That's diversity. So there are many ways of understanding sexuality as there are individuals, because we all have a different taste.
Right.
There are many, different characters, because we're all different. So if that's your broad understanding, then to incorporate these things shouldn't be difficult. And it's definitely there in the text. But let's talk about this.
Okay. What is this?
This is the form of Shiva and Parvati. One half is Shiva, one half is Parvati. One half is male, one half is female. And this is a recognized deity where the female and male come together. I mean, more than symbolically.
Right.
So Indian religion, what does it have to teach us? Just look at that form. Complicated.
Yeah.
So it's not, Hinduism isn't simply a reactionary force. It's not simply repressive. It's got a lot more to say. And I think we have to explore the depth. So we have someone that say, homosexuality is bad. Well, in Hinduism, you look for a philosophical reason. Every theology has a philosophical basis. So you're asked in the scripture to question. This is a requirement.
Right.
So you have to question every statement.
Right.
So
right.
and then you look at a form. Someone says homosexuality is a bad thing. I say, what's going on here then?
Yeah.
This doesn't represent homosexuality, but it represents something pretty funky.
Right.
So this is not a simple culture.
Right.
So you have gay sex represented on sculptural reliefs in quite conservative temples. And in different parts of India.
Right.
So it's not just localized to one community who just happen to be liberal or something. This is pervasive. So again, what's going on? They're not denying it, and they're even representing it.
Right.
So
and very explicitly, openly. It's the first thing you see when you.
It's very explicit.
Right.
I had the benefit of going to the Tirupati temple at the time of Vaikuntha Ekadashi, which is like one of its holiest days. It's nearly impossible to get in. The queue is 36 hours long to get into the temple. Somehow I got in, and I was in the queue, thrilled with myself, and going past one of the columns. This is one of the most sacred, conservative temples. Going past one of the, and there, emblazoned in the column, is a sculpture of a sex act. And as I went by, I went, and I couldn't go back and see it again just to do a double take because you're being pushed along in the queue. Right. But it was like, what?
But it's definitely something you wouldn't expect in a temple.
You definitely don't expect it in that kind of conservative temple. Yeah. So it's not that these things aren't, that no one's aware of them. It's not, they're not encouraging them, but they're not encouraging sexuality per se. They're asking, control your senses, keep it together. Yeah. Now control of the senses for someone who has thought about spirituality and practiced it for an awfully long time is very different from someone who's starting off, whose control of the senses might be cut it down to twice a week, whereas someone else is just not engaging in sexuality at all. And that kind of self-regulation, it's up to the individual to decide.
Right.
The Gita is saying, if you can't do this, do this. If you can't do this, do this. If you can't. That's how Hinduism discusses these things. Right. So it doesn't exclude anyone.
Right.
So it doesn't exclude anyone, and anyone who can perceive this form and understand it, and understand that this is beyond a sexual discourse. So the interaction of Radha and Krishna is not about sexuality. The fact that Krishna wears girls' clothing sometimes to fool people, and Gopishwar Shiva, becomes a female so that he can dance with Krishna, and all that stuff. This is not considered in any way sexual, but it's very fluid in terms of identity. So this needs to be discussed.
Right.
You want to talk about Indian ideas about sexual identity or identity per se? Very interesting. If you have the ability to have that intellectual discourse, then that's a tremendous benefit to society. But that ability is based on your educational system, and India at the moment doesn't have the educational system that can support that kind of high level of thinking. so that we can really get to grips with what are the real issues in society, what are the real issues of identity, why the fear of certain types of people, why the fear of certain communities, where does this fear come from? Fear means ignorance. It means you don't know, so that you retract, you close the door to keep people out, because you don't know what they're going to do. You don't,
right.
You know.
I guess it also, it to some degree, it may even threaten someone else's identity. If someone has such confidence certainly. In their, gender or sexual orientation.
Certainly, yeah.
And maybe some of the criticisms stem from such a disposition.
Yeah. Well, that's a given. That's normal human relationships. We all become destabilized when we meet someone who doesn't conform to our way of seeing the world. Right. So 40 years.
Why isn't he like me, or why isn't she like me? Right.
Yeah, exactly. That's those identity issues. 40 years ago, I became a Hindu as a white Irishman. Bit of a shock, in Ireland of the 70s. And I understood why people would react to me the way they did. Some people were really afraid. Some people would come up and say, "I'll pray for you that you can come back to the normal way of thinking," and all that kind of stuff. And some people just rejected me as their friend and had all kinds of responses. But some were very loving at the same time. Some were just embracing and saying, "That's what you want to be? Yep, fine." So it's interesting. How are people responding based on their consciousness, based on their knowledge base, based on their vision? They have a very broad vision, based on the fact that they see people as people, not as categories or things. So some people see through certain identities and they're looking at the heart, and then they just trust, this is a good person. So the fact that they're, changing their religion, or they're, espousing a different way of seeing the world is not an issue for them, because there's something more important. That's the important thing. That's their vision. Fine. Some people it's more intellectual. Fine. So we all come to it in different ways. But, when we see in ourselves, and it happens to all of us at some time, that we react in a kind of a visceral way to someone or something, we have to put the alarm bells on in our own head. Okay. That yes, there's something not quite balanced about this. Now I'm afraid. Now I'm out of my comfort zone. I have to learn about this. I have to gain more knowledge. Right. Education again is the answer. To be fearful is no way to live.
Yeah. And Hinduism is a big proponent of such a.
Well, Abhayam, the quality of fearlessness, is one of the qualities that you're supposed to develop in your life in terms of development of consciousness. Right. You're supposed to become fearless. I mean, to create law based on fear, to create social norms based on fear, that's creating the basis of a terrible society. And that's what happened, when this criminalization was brought in. And now we're taking away the fear factor by making it decriminalized. It's not something to be afraid of. It's just a thing. It's just something that happens, and it's not your taste. Fair enough. Do something else. Yeah. But you don't have to, criminalize someone because they like ice cream. Yeah. I said, thank you very much. So thank you so much for this, participating in this discussion and interview. Very fascinating. Very hope it's sometimes helpful. It's just not very much so. Not just some strange rant. No, it's very, very interesting. Very helpful. It gives us a very different perspective on homosexuality in India, particularly exploring the Hindu position and exploring that in more detail and depth. So thank you so much.